The man looked at her children before he looked at her. His eyes were cold, the kind of cold that comes from surviving too many winters. He stood in the dry Kansas yard, dust swirling around his boots, and pointed toward the empty prairie. "Go to town before the snow comes," he told her. "Go before you kill those children." Margaret Roth did not answer. She had 3 children standing behind her. 6-year-old Anna held her little brother Peter's hand. Baby Wilhelm rested against Margaret's chest. The wind moved through the tall prairie grass like a warning. Margaret had 11 weeks until winter. She had $2.40, and she had no husband. 5 months earlier, she had buried Johann Roth on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He had come to Kansas full of hope, dreaming of building a stone house on their land in Rush County, and he had laid the foundation himself, 12 feet by 14 feet, thick limestone rising from the earth like a promise. That promise was still there. But Johann was not. Fever had taken him in the summer of 1887. By Thursday, Margaret had placed him in the ground behind their sod dugout, the same land where he once planned to plant apple trees. Now she was 29 years old, alone on a claim that required 3 more years before it would legally belong to her. The dugout roof sagged more each time it rained. Dirt fell from the ceiling onto the children's beds. The center beam had cracked. It would not survive another winter. She needed 6 cords of firewood to live through a Kansas winter. She had less than 1. The neighbors came with bread and quiet advice. Sell the claim. Go to town. Find work as a servant. A woman alone cannot survive out here. The men came too. They carried away Johann's tools. They took his stacked cottonwood. 6 cords hauled from 40 miles away. They called it sharing. They said Johann would have wanted it that way. Margaret said nothing. By late August, she understood the truth. The numbers did not work. A wooden cabin would lose heat too fast. She could not afford coal. She could not cut enough wood. She could not build a stone house alone. Then came the sheriff's auction in La Crosse. She walked 4 miles with Wilhelm tied to her back and Anna leading Peter by the hand. She hoped to find tools or scraps of lumber. Instead, she found something strange. The auctioneer announced the Krager property. The Krager family had lost everything in a fire that spring. Their barn burned. Their house burned. And the father died trying to save his horses. All that remained standing was a stone granary, a tall, round cylinder of limestone, 18 feet high, walls nearly 2 feet thick. But the roof had burned away. It was nothing but stone walls and open sky. $5, the auctioneer called. No one moved. $3. Silence. $2. Margaret raised her hand. She did not fully understand why she did it. The granary was useless. No roof, no floor, no chimney, no door fit for winter. But the walls were thick, 2 feet of solid limestone. She remembered something from her childhood in Russia, houses built with heavy walls that held warmth even after the fire burned low. Her grandmother used to press her palm against the clay walls in winter and say, "The walls remember the sun." The idea came to her slowly. What if the walls could do the work? What if she did not need a big house? What if she only needed a small space with thick walls that could store heat? It sounded foolish. Everyone would laugh, but she had no other choice. The next morning, she walked 6 miles north to see what she had bought. The granary stood alone on the prairie, blackened from fire but unbroken. The stones were dark with soot, yet solid. Fire had destroyed the roof, but it had not cracked the limestone. She stepped inside. It was cooler than the outside air. Even under the hot September sun, The inside felt steady, calm. She pressed her hand against the stone. The walls were cool now, but they would remember heat too. The space inside was small, just over 100 square feet, smaller than her dugout, but smaller meant less air to heat. Yet the circular shape had no corners for wind to attack. If she could build a roof, if she could cut a chimney, if she could seal the doorway, it might work. It had to work. She stood alone in that burned stone cylinder and imagined her children sleeping against the curved walls while a small stove glowed in the center. Either it would save them, or it would become their tomb. Behind her, footsteps sounded in the grass. Anna Krieger, the widow who once owned the land, stood at the doorway dressed in black. "You bought it?" she asked. Margaret nodded. "Why?" "The walls are thick," Margaret answered quietly. Anna stared at the stone. "My husband built this for wheat, not for living. It did not save him." Margaret did not argue. She only looked at the walls again. Winter was coming. She had 8 weeks, $2, 3 children, and now a burned stone silo that everyone believed was useless. She turned toward home as the prairie wind picked up. Behind her, the stone walls stood silent under the wide Kansas sky. They did not look like salvation, but they were the only chance she had. Margaret began the next morning. There was no time to doubt. The prairie grass was already turning yellow, and each sunrise felt closer to winter. She walked to the burned property at first light and studied the fallen barn beams again. Most of them were cracked and weak from the fire, but a few were still solid at the core. She wrapped a rope around the first beam and leaned her full weight into it. The timber did not move at first. She pulled again. Her boots slid in the dust, her shoulders burned, and the rope cut into her palms. Slowly, inch by inch, and the beam dragged across the ground. It took her nearly an hour to move it a quarter mile. She did not stop. For 3 days, she dragged beams across the prairie. 8 heavy timbers in total. 24 miles of pulling under the hot Kansas sun. Anna carried small boards. Peter gathered nails from the ashes. Wilhelm lay on a blanket in the shade, watching his mother build a future he did not understand. Inside the stone silo, Margaret dug a deep hole in the center of the dirt floor. She set the tallest beam upright and packed earth tightly around its base. It stood like a spine in the middle of the round room. Then she raised the other beams from the center post to the top of the stone walls, shaping them like the ribs of an umbrella. They did not fit perfectly. Some were uneven. Some were charred. But rope and nails held them together. It was rough. It was not pretty, but it was strong. After that, she cut sod from the prairie. Each piece was thick with roots and heavy with damp soil. She sliced it into blocks and hauled them to the silo on a small cart she built from scraps. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. Her fingers split and bled. Layer by layer, she laid the sod over the wooden frame. Grass side down. Soil on top. Pressed tight so rain would run off instead of soaking through. When she finished, the silo no longer stared at the open sky. It had a roof. The first rain came days later. Margaret stood inside with her children and listened. No drops fell. The interior stayed dry. For the first time since Johann's death, she allowed herself to breathe. But the roof was only half the battle. She still needed a chimney. Stone does not break easily. She climbed a ladder with a hammer and chisel and began cutting through the thick limestone wall. Each strike sent dust into her face. Each inch felt like a mile. 5 days passed. She had barely cut 3 inches into the 2-foot wall. Her hands were raw and shaking, when an old stonemason named Friedrich Bauer stopped by. He watched her work without speaking. Then he took the hammer from her. "You're doing it wrong," he said quietly. He showed her how to drill small guide holes first, how to strike at the right angle, how to let the stone split where it wanted to split. In 4 hours, he did what she could not do in 5 days. A clean 8-inch hole opened through the wall. When he finished, he wiped his hands and said, "Your husband would have done the same for me." Then he left. October arrived with frost that painted the prairie white. Margaret moved her children into the silo. Inside stood Johann's small iron stove. Straw mattresses lined the curved walls. Blankets covered the doorway to block drafts. Shelves held 40 pounds of flour, dried beans, and a few jars of preserved vegetables. Her fuel pile was small. Cow chips gathered from the prairie, twisted hay bundles, a few scraps of wood. Thought it was not enough for a normal house. But this was not a normal house. On the first cold night, she lit the stove. The temperature inside was barely above freezing. The fire crackled. An hour later, the air felt warmer. By midnight, the children had pushed their blankets down from their faces. Margaret pressed her palm against the limestone wall. It was warm. The stone had taken in the heat and was slowly giving it back. The walls were remembering. Through November, the wind tested the structure. Blizzards roared across the open prairie. Snow hit the curved walls and slid around them. The small round shape gave the wind nothing to grab. Inside, the temperature dropped slowly instead of suddenly. She burned less fuel than any family in a wooden cabin. Still, her supply shrank every week by early January, yet her pile was half gone, and Wilhelm began to cough. At first, it was small. Then it grew deeper. By January 10th, he had a fever. Margaret held him through the night, counting every breath. Outside, the prairie seemed calm. Too calm. On January 12th, the morning felt strangely warm. Snow began to melt. The children laughed outside the doorway. Margaret stepped away from the silo to gather the last of the cow chips. At 10:30 in the morning, she saw something on the horizon, a dark line moving fast. By 11, the temperature had dropped sharply. By noon, the wind hit like a wall. Snow exploded across the prairie so thick she could not see her own hands. Margaret fell to her knees. The cold did not feel like weather. It felt like an attack. She crawled through the white storm, searching blindly for the stone wall. But her fingers struck limestone. She followed the curve until she found the doorway and fell inside. The children were crying. Snow blew through small gaps. The stove was cold. She struck a match. It blew out. Another. It blew out. The 5th match caught. She fed the stove everything she could. The wind screamed outside. The chimney pipe rattled. Snow slipped through cracks and scattered across the floor. Wilhelm's fever burned hotter. She fed the fire higher than ever before. The stone walls absorbed the heat, while the world outside froze solid. By afternoon, the temperature outside had fallen below 0. By evening, it dropped lower. She watched her fuel pile disappear. Each chip she burned meant less for later. But without heat, Wilhelm would die. She chose the fire. She chose her son. As night fell, yet the storm grew worse. Inside, the air began to drop despite the flames. 46 degrees. 42. 38. Her fuel was almost gone. Wilhelm's fever finally broke. His small body relaxed in her arms. He began to breathe easier. Margaret wept quietly. But the storm was not finished, and neither was the night. She looked at the shrinking pile of fuel and understood a hard truth. By midnight, there would be nothing left to burn. She wrapped all 3 children together in blankets in the center of the room. She let the fire fade to embers. The stone walls were warm now, holding the day's heat deep inside them. Outside, the temperature kept falling. 20 below, 30 below. Inside, the air dropped slowly. 36, 34, 32. Freezing. Margaret lay awake, holding her children, if feeling the last warmth seep from the stone. The fire was dead. The fuel was gone. The walls were giving back their final memory of heat. She listened to the wind and waited to see if her children would still be breathing when morning came. Morning came slowly. A thin gray light slipped through the blanket covering the doorway. The wind had stopped. The world outside was silent. Margaret opened her eyes. For a moment, she did not move. She listened. Anna was breathing. Peter was breathing. Wilhelm stirred against her chest and let out a soft cry. They were alive. The air inside the stone silo was freezing cold. Ice had formed on the water bucket. Their breath rose in pale clouds. The fire was nothing but ash. Margaret reached out and touched the wall. The limestone was no longer warm. It was cold now, but it had held long enough. She gathered the last few chips she had saved and fed them into the stove. The small flame felt like a miracle. Slowly, warmth returned to the air. Not much, just enough to bring life back into their fingers. When she opened the door, snow stood nearly 4 feet high against the curved wall. The prairie stretched out in white silence. No fences, no roads, no signs of neighbors. The storm had erased everything. For 3 days, the county dug itself out. Stories began to spread. Families trapped in barns, children lost on the walk home from school, cabins frozen solid. More than 200 people had died across the plains. Margaret did not know the number. She only knew her children had survived. On the 3rd day after the storm, Margaret Roth walked up to the silo, and he stood outside for a long time, staring at the structure he once called foolish. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. Finally, he stepped inside. The room was warm enough that the children had loosened their blankets. Wilhelm rested peacefully in Margaret's arms. Heinrich placed his hand against the stone wall. He kept it there for several seconds. "The walls are 2 feet thick," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "The space is small." She nodded again. "The round shape turns the wind." Silence filled the room. "I told you that you would freeze," he said. "I told you your children would die." Margaret said nothing. Heinrich lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." It was not easy for a man like him to say those words. He had built houses all over Rush County. He believed he understood stone better than anyone. Yet this widow, alone with 3 children, had discovered something he had never tried. "The stone holds heat," he said softly, "like a clay pot holds water." He looked around the small room, at the curved walls, at the stove, at the simple beds pressed close together. "Others will want to know how you did this." "Then I will show them," Margaret replied. He nodded once and left. A week later, Anna Krieger came back. She walked slowly around the silo her husband had once built for wheat. Her eyes were no longer filled with bitterness. "You lived," she said. "Yes." Anna stepped inside and sat near the stove. "My husband built these walls strong," she whispered. "But we never thought of living inside them." "Neither did I," Margaret answered, "until I had no other choice." Anna looked at the roof, at the chimney hole cut through the stone. and at the careful way the beds were placed against the curved wall. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "If I build again?" Margaret reached for her hand. "Yes." Word spread quickly. Families who had lost cattle, families who had burned furniture to stay alive, families who had nearly frozen in thin wooden cabins. They came to see the burned silo that had become a home. Margaret showed them everything. How the thick limestone absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. How the circular walls gave the wind nothing to attack. How a smaller space needed less fuel. She did not charge them. She only shared what she had learned. By the next winter, several new stone structures stood across Rush County. Some were round. Some were square, with thick walls and heavy sod roofs. Heinrich Roth built 3 himself, each one smaller than the houses he once believed were best. Margaret proved up her claim 5 years later. She never married again. She expanded the stone silo as her children grew, adding a small room and later a kitchen. But the original cylinder remained the heart of the home. Anna grew into a strong young woman. Peter learned to work the land. Wilhelm, the baby who burned with fever the night of the great storm, survived and grew tall. But the silo that once stored wheat had stored something greater: life. Years passed. The storm of January 12, 1888, became known as the Children's Blizzard. Across the plains, it was remembered for the lives it took. But in Rush County, some remembered something else. They remembered a widow who bought a burned stone silo for $2. They remembered the man who told her she would freeze. They remembered the night the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 hours. And they remembered that inside a small stone cylinder with walls 2 feet thick, 3 children slept through the deadliest winter storm of their time. Long after Margaret Roth was gone, the stones from that silo were used to build a fence on the prairie. The house was gone. The story almost disappeared. But the truth remained. The walls had remembered the sun, and because they remembered, her children lived.